Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for a quorum. And here it comes. We're good to go. Good morning. My name is Jeremiah Ellison. I am the chair of the Council's Elections and Rules Committee, and I'm going to call this meeting to the committee to order for May 9th, 2018. Joining me at the dais this morning are Councilmembers Palmisano, Johnson, Warsami, Schrader, myself, Ellison, Cunningham, Fletcher, Cano, and Gordon. Let the record reflect that we have a quorum. Colleagues, we have 3 items on the agenda this morning. The first 2 are reports, and the third item is for the proposed relocation of a polling place in the 2nd Ward, which requires our recommendation and formal action by the full council. If there are no objections, let's do items 1 and 3 and save item 2 for last because it's a little longer. Let the record reflect that we've been joined by Council President Bender. The first item is the annual report of the city's Ethical Practices Board. Making that presentation today is our Ethics Officer, Managing City Attorney Susan Trammell. Good morning, Susan Trammell.
Good morning, Chair Ellison and members of the committee. I have mailed out to each of you, and I believe there is an annual report in each of your packets today, and I'm just going to mention a few of the highlights from that. Each and every year, obtaining good compliance with required ethics education is always one of the ethics officer's challenges, and the board takes it very seriously, the component that employees, elected officials, and the residents who are appointed to our boards and commissions be in compliance with ethics ed. To that regard, I want to bring your attention to page 5 of the annual report, where there is an employee ethics education status by department report. I want to let you know that this report is generated through comment, through queries that are done as of December 31st of each year. Interestingly, because of the election last year, the numbers for the mayor's office are quite high. It shows 23 employees in that office, and that counts both mayors. Okay, prior mayor, current mayor. And so if it had been accurate, it would have shown that there were 14 employees other than Mayor Hodges, and all of them were current with ethics education. But because of the transition, there were more employees counted, and those employees were not either up to date in their ethics or hadn't had an opportunity to take ethics yet. So that's one thing I wanted to call out on that chart. Excuse me. And then I want to give some kudos here, because we have 3 departments who have very high ethics compliance, the highest that I have ever seen. The first is community planning and economic development. And just the other day I was online and I noted that they have, at the time of this report, they were 97% compliant, but the day I checked, they were 100% compliant. And that's just outstanding for a department of that size. The other 2 that are at 97 and then 96% compliant are information technology and the police department. And I wanted to just note that the police department had made a very strong effort in both 2006 and then into the beginning of 2016 into 2017 to get everyone up to date on their training. And so those efforts that they've made have really paid off. And that helped raise the status from the 73% that we were in compliance in 2016 up to about 83% this year. And so we're going to push with the remaining departments to get them up to speed this year and see if we can even get into the 90s for next year. The other piece with ethics education is the board and commission training. And that is always a challenge because there seem to always be vacancies and new people being appointed. But we're working with the city clerk's office and with the liaisons from staff to these boards and commissions to try to get those members up to date for their ethics ed as well. The next section of the report has to do with the ethics inquiries. So every time one of you or one of your staff members or any other employee or a member of board or commissions calls for ethics advice, it gets logged. It's logged in an anonymous manner, and generally not even the department is mentioned. It's all designed so that it can be presented to the ethics board when the board meets as a summary of advice. And there will be certain advice issues that they want to then discuss at their meetings. And so they can pull them from that ethics officer report and discuss them. The reason that the report is given to them every 2 months is that the advice that I, as ethics officer, give you is not binding on the board. Not that they have disagreed with me any time in my recent, that I can recall even, but they do want to be aware of what is going on, and that the advice that I give by the ordinance is not binding on the board. So as to the chart on page 6, discusses all the various ethics inquiries that came in through the year. And usually the top 3 categories have historically, since 2006, when I started in this role, the number 1 category had always been gifts. Last year was the very first year that it was no longer gifts. It was surpassed by conflict of interest. And so gifts is still in the top 3. It's just not, the ranking that it was of before. But the inquiries, generally, the top 3 are the same ones. And occasionally when we have an election, political activity will spike, but it never spikes so much to get into the top 3. They're pretty consistent from year to year. And I think the chart on page 7 shows you the percentage of inquiries for each section of the ethics code and the changes that it has from year to year. So you can see those trends there. The last area of the annual report that I want to draw to your attention are the ethics complaints. And the complaints come in from a variety of sources, and they're all reported there on page 8. And most of the reports do come in through the ethics report line, the anonymous hotline, the hotline that allows for anonymous reporting. And in fact, if a person uses the hotline, they generally report anonymously. And that presents issues for following up on complaints, because there's generally not enough information to proceed on a complaint. And we still have to prove them. And so if people, they will file a complaint tending to think, oh, I can get this action to happen. I can get this person terminated or disciplined by just making a complaint. But that they have this misunderstanding. So we're doing a lot of education with the employees to indicate that proper use of the hotline still requires that we prove up, and there has to be actual evidence in order to pursue any disciplinary action based on a hotline report. And yet most of our hotline reports, over 81% of them are filed anonymously. And so they have those issues. As a result of the quality of those kinds of reports and the content, if you look on page 9, you'll see that in the end of the year status report for carryover complaints and complaints from 2017, for those that closed out, discipline was only imposed in 3 cases. And that has to do with all the allegations. So you get a number of complaints, and that number is smaller than all the allegations, usually by quite a bit. And so we had 45 complaints in 2017, and they contained 92 allegations. And that's just the ones that came in through me. Other reports are reported by the departments. Departments have required reporting obligations, and I've worked quite a bit with Public Works and with the police department to ensure that we're getting the ethics-related complaints that they've received. And so we get some complaints that way as well. Now, so between all those methods of over 92 allegations, we've had 3 result in discipline. Okay. The vast majority of them are unsubstantiated and there's no action taken. And that's just based on the all allegations, but also complaint wise as well. So when there is action taken, it's usually one of 3 things. A department makes a change in its rules and its procedures, or does some training. Those are all considered department action taken. There are coaching incidences which don't rise to discipline, then coaching can occur. And then there's just the general administrative closures for various reasons. The person's no longer employed here. There's no jurisdiction. There's been no investigation because the complaint itself was frivolous on its face, and all of those have been approved for dismissal by the board. So various different actions can occur from these. But the number of complaints this year is consistent with the complaints from past years, as same as the allegations. And then just the type of complaint, we've noticed a trend that this year there are more bias or favoritism allegations than there have been in past years. And this increased to 20 allegations this year from 7 in 2016. And they can be complicated subjects to prove. And a lot of times they come up because someone feels that their supervisor or manager is treating them unfairly and treating someone else more favorably. And they come to the conclusion that it's because of an unfair bias or favoritism. Yet a lot of times through investigation, these complaints aren't substantiated. There's some of the ones that are unsubstantiated after investigation with no action taken, because you do find that there's actually a reason for the actions that were taken by the supervisors, that it wasn't just based on a bias or a favoritism, that they had reasons for the actions that they took. So that is my summary of the complaints. The report also contains the 2018 work plan that the Ethics Board has approved. What I'd like to note about that one is that we are doing continuation of new ethics education materials in collaboration with the HR department, and ultimately IT will be involved because it will be an online training as well. We're continuing to review the ethics code for amendments to improve the effectiveness of the code, and also collaborating with the Human Resources Department regarding potential code of conduct inclusions in future code amendments, and at the direction of Councilmember Gordon. And then we have interest in moving forward, the board has interest in moving forward to seek an IGR action for the future legislative sessions to change the way statement of economic interest reporting is done. But that's quite a long-term project. I don't see anything happening this year, even though it's still on the work plan as a placeholder. Are there any questions that you have for me?
Thank you, Ms. Trammell. Any questions?
Great.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair. I have a few questions. First, I wanted to look at the training by departments.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of had an observation that it's hard when I look at this to see what the city council has in terms of training and who's left. I assume they must be wrapped into the city clerk.
No, Chair. Councilmember Gordon and Chair Ellison, members of the committee, no. Council members are excluded from this report.
Okay.
Because council members are on a 4-year cycle of training and employees are on a 3-year cycle of training. And so for 2017, if they'd been counted on the 3-year cycle, then council members would have all been deemed out of compliance. So they're excluded from the reporting.
What about our staff?
Your staff is included in here, and some of your staff were not up to date, but most staff is now up to date because in 2018, they did training on January 11th that I did in person. And so I can produce to each of you a listing of your staff and whether they're in or out of compliance, and I can get that out to you yet this week. As far as council member training, this current council had required training on 22nd of February, and 12 of the 13 of you are in compliance right now, and we're working on trying to get specialized, individualized training scheduled for the remaining council members.
I guess I'm more interested in having that information available to the public through the report. So I don't know if we can think about how we want this table to be in future years, because I think it would be nice for people to see if council members are all trained and our offices. And I think that's probably all. I also noticed that there are some departments that are all in the city coordinator's office, and they're listed separately: communications, human resources, IT, finance, and that maybe makes some sense to break them out into their own departments or divisions, and it's all a matter of semantics. But so I'm not necessarily saying we have to change that, but when you look at city coordinator, that means we're going to have to imagine the equity division, sustainability division. Some divisions are in there, but some divisions get their own heading. So something to think about. I also want to talk a little bit more about page 9. So that's where we get into the complaints. And particularly, I'm interested in the bias and favoritism and discrimination and harassment. And it's hard for me to know how to track these because all the columns add up to slightly different figures. And then there's even the paragraph on discrimination and harassment that lets us know there's been really 53 total, I guess, or so not necessarily 10. So I worry that that's maybe trending higher. And it looks like what we're saying there is that we receive complaints from somewhere else. And so it's really more than 10.
Chair.
Is that right? Is it the total 53 or is the total 63?
Councilmember Gordon, Chair Ellison, and members of the committee. I only have access to the complaints that are reported through the hotline and to me as ethics officer. But the city also has an anti-discrimination, harassment, retaliation policy, and complaints that fall under protected class are handled and reported to, for the most part, to the HR department. And they're handled through Steve Kennedy, who's an investigator of that unit. He, at the end of the year, reports to me his numbers because we have some overlap, because I get some reports through the hotline that get referred to him. And so if you look on this chart on the top of page 9, there are 10 that came in via the hotline directly to me or reported through the ethics process. They are part and parcel of his other complaints. He received 62 complaints in 2017, but that includes the 10 from the hotline. So yes, if we were to count discrimination or harassment complaints, they are the greatest number of complaints, but they are governed by that other policy and not so much by the ethics code itself. And so I don't have any information to any of that data that's involved, other than that he gives me his numbers at the end of each year.
So we also don't have the ability to look back to see if 62 is more than 2016 or less than 2016, because all we have is the hotline numbers.
No, Councilmember Gordon, Chair Ellison, members of the committee, I could go back through each and every one of the annual reports because Mr. Kennedy has been reporting to me, and we can see if their numbers are trending up. And they probably have in HR as well some statistics regarding their trends. I am working with the HR department in collaboration to through the hotline itself. We've renewed a contract and we've obtained more seat licenses One of the purposes of that amendment is to get a seat license for each of the human resources generalists, because complaints that come in through the hotline are usually handled by the department supervisor of the people involved and the human resources generalist. And we're trying to get a better picture with HR of what types of complaints are being dealt with, what issues there are in the workplace. And so through use of the hotline statistics tracking capabilities, we will probably be able to even add issues that come up. The HRGs can add issues, and so we may have better tracking in the future. We're working together to try to determine better, more trends.
Well, that would be probably be good to make it more useful if we had more information. I'm also concerned because we don't see discrimination separated from harassment. And I'm not sure if, I think we would want to know if, and it might even be a good thing if some of the harassment complaints were going up in this day and age and people wanted to come forward with more information than they might not have in the past. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. In fact, sometimes an uptick in reporting is a good thing, and we want to see that so we know what's going on. But the fact that they're together makes it a little difficult for us to know, let's say in light of the Me Too movement and those kinds of things, if we wanted to say, how's our city doing? What's going on here? What information can we have? That's just a nugget to take back. I understand they're merged in the code, so there they are together for us here. I did also want to say that it's hard to know what number to rely on when we're looking at the kind of the disposition or what happened to the complaints, because I'm not sure whether the universe, so the listing of what's pending, unsubstantiated, department action, I'm assuming if department actions taken that could have included coaching or discipline, right?
Councilmember Gordon, Chair Ellison, and members of the committee. Two things. One, I want to just mention related to discrimination and harassment. This is a report of the Ethical Practices Board, the items under their jurisdiction. And so they don't have any of that information, and they don't review any of these complaints involving discrimination or harassment. And they also would not be primary if a complaint came in about even a department head under the discrimination and harassment policy. The HR department would be lead on that. So their ethics business that they conduct through the ordinance does not include any of this information that you'd like to see related to discrimination or harassment. It just doesn't come before them as a board. But we can, get that information from the HR department itself. But then as to your question about the results that come from the disposition of ethics complaints, you had asked if it said department action taken, if those numbers also included coaching. No, a department action taken does not include coaching.
Or discipline.
Or discipline. It includes, the only thing that encompasses department action taking would be they provided some training, they changed some work rules, they adopted a new work rule, those types of things.
Okay, that's helpful.
Discipline imposed is separate. Coaching is its own category. And also, sometimes complaints are unsubstantiated, but there's been coaching regardless. So that's counted as coaching. The only ones that are counted as unsubstantiated are the ones that are unsubstantiated, no action taken. So there's nothing there. They did nothing.
And the reason why there might be more that are listed here than the 48 that we see with the complaints that came in 2017 is because some of these might have been left over from previous years.
Councilmember Gordon, Chair Ellison, members of the committee, there are two reasons why the numbers don't equal the 2017 complaints. One is that, yes, there were some that carried over. That's one reason. And then also, sometimes there's more than one outcome. So you could have had both discipline imposed and coaching or department action taken. And sometimes you have a complaint that has 3 allegations. One allegation might not be proven, it's unsubstantiated, no action taken, but another allegation involved coaching or discipline. And so they try to cover all bases without getting a chart that has every single allegation listed.
Well, they did call them complaints, but I guess you can have, I don't know. So
you could
it's hard
have
for us
more
to
than one
understand what,
outcome.
yeah, it looks like it. And then it's hard for us actually to know what percentage of complaints led to discipline. But I'll try to understand it better as I look at it. I also think it's difficult when we have things coming through different tracks, like HR has these harassment and then the ethics, and it'd be nice if it was a little bit clearer so we could get a handle on. My last question is, when we look at some of these complaints, can we find out if they're coming from what departments or areas? So if we see an uptick in bias and favoritism, are you tracking whether or not that's coming from maybe the same complainant, or is it within the same department, or do we not know that information?
Councilmember Gordon, Chair Ellison, members of the committee, most of the complaints are anonymous. So we don't know who the complainant is. Nearly 80% of the complaints come in anonymously.
And do we know what department they're from?
We have a few complaints, believe it or not, where through the hotline, here's my favorite one. Caller, name declined, reports unknown.
But what about the ones
occasionally, they don't even tell you who the subject of their complaint is, but they want you to do something. But generally, we do know who all the departments are.
do we okay, well, I guess I won't ask for details now because you probably don't have them available anyway, but I think that's something that some people might want to be aware of if there's uptick in some complaints from certain departments and not others. But I appreciate everybody for tolerating my questions. It'd be nice if we could maybe streamline it a little bit more and have to know where to go next. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Trammell. When I was reading through this report last night, something that really stuck out to me, and you mentioned it, was the boards and commissions compliance. I think that the report said it was around 58%, and you had mentioned some partnerships. So I was just hoping for you to elaborate on how you hope to achieve a higher rate of compliance. Have you been working with the Clerk's Department or NCR? And what are the plans to be able to increase compliance there?
Councilmember Cunningham, Chair Ellison, and members of the committee. In fact, we had a meeting this morning that was brought together by Casey Carl, City Clerk, related to boards and commissions, at which all liaisons to boards and commissions were invited. So all staff were invited. And at that meeting, I again mentioned some of the boards and commissions that were in great compliance. We had, I think, 2 or 3 that have 100% compliance as of the date my report was made. You know, things change. But as of the date the report was made, Animal Care and Control, their board, advisory board, and then the Bicycle Advisory Board and the Pedestrian Advisory Board are at 100% compliance. None of the other boards are at that compliance, but we're going to send out another mailing to the liaisons. We discussed it at the meeting today, that the need for this training is required, that training is required and people need to comply. And then we're going to send out a mailing to all the liaisons and give them their information and a link to the training so they can encourage their members to take the training. That's generally been the method that we've had. I know that the city clerk's office also tried to get training into the appointment process. So when people were appointed, they were right away informed they needed to take their training.
Great. As they're onboarded, are they, because it's online, right? So they're able to do it online?
It is online.
Okay. So as they're onboarding, are they given the link and everything, or just told that they have to do it?
Councilmember Cunningham, Chair Ellison, and members of the committee, my understanding is that when they revised that onboarding process and created the manual, that they were given the link at the time.
Great. And one last question, Mr. Chair, thank you. So you had mentioned about favoritism and bias being really challenging to prove, and that ultimately a lot of times they were unsubstantiated because there was some reason why whatever happened. One of the insidious aspects of bias is that, for example, you might have one person who does something, two people who do the same thing that is not following the rules, but then the level of discipline is different between the two of them. And so how does this process take that into consideration if we were to have peers in a department doing the same thing, but then depending on some sort of classified protected class or whatever, or protected class, that they receive a more harsh punishment instead? How is that taken into consideration?
Councilmember Cunningham, Chair Ellison, members of the committee, the ethics board and I as ethics officer do not get involved in investigations of complaints related to the code. Those are all sent to departments for handling, and they're handled usually by the department head in conjunction with the supervisor of the parties involved and the human resources generalist. I don't know if there's ever been any tracking done. I do know that so few of the complaints historically over the 12 years that I've done this, so few of the complaints actually result in discipline at all that there wouldn't be enough there to even compare. Okay. Now, when you're talking protected class and bias or favoritism, I don't believe that most of those come in as protected class. They aren't handled as bias or favoritism. They are handled through the HR department, through the discrimination, harassment, retaliation policy. And so, you know, they would maybe have some information on that and how they've done that. But we don't see those complaints.
Yeah, just thinking about how oftentimes bias is connected with bias against a protected class. It might be helpful, just thinking from my perspective as a former city staffer, about being able to, if I'm experiencing something, just clarity around, like, do I go to the ethics? Do I, ethics officer? Do I go to civil rights? Like, who do I go to? Because when I see favoritism and bias, like, that is something that automatically comes to mind for me, is like racial unconscious bias. And so I hear the separation there, but I think for me it's a little bit hard to pull that apart because it oftentimes does play a role. So thank you for that. I appreciate your answers.
Thank you, Councilmember Cunningham. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief, but I just wanted to thank you very much for the work and making sure that we have a well-run ethics process in our city. And I think the council members, when we participated in our training, we had a really good discussion and had the chance to ask you questions and go through scenarios. We heard some stories from other cities that you might imagine, like, how could anyone ever think to do this? How did anyone get themselves in this situation? But it has happened, and it was a good refresher, I think, for all of us to remember, just the way that our system is supposed to be working. And I know there's a lot of commitment in this council for us to be to lead in a way that is responding to all of our ethical responsibilities. I also wanted to say that I think an important piece of our ethics process is that there are so many different ways that a complaint can be handled, and that the coaching piece of it is really important in order to create a system where, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is make sure everyone is working in an environment that's supportive and free from harassment and other issues. And so when we have a system that protects the anonymity of people who are making complaints, and people feel that they can trust the system, when we have opportunities for training and coaching and improvement, I think that helps us, everyone in the city feel comfortable using that. And I always encourage people to use our ethics complaint system when they have a concern or a question, because it's there to protect all of us as a city, and to, again, make sure that all of our employees and people that we are serving, feel protected and feel that they that all of us at the city are upholding those highest standards of ethics. So anyway, just wanted to note how important I think all of this is.
Thank you, Council President Bender. Are there any other questions or comments? Seeing none, I'll continue. I just wanted to thank you for the report. While no process and no document is perfect, this document is certainly thorough. So I just wanted to thank you for that, Ms. Trammell. No action is required or requested on this report. So without objection, I will direct that the report be received and filed. Skipping quickly to item number 3. All those in favor of receiving and filing, say aye.
Aye.
I think that's unanimous. Ayes have it. All right, I'm going to skip quickly to item 3. Item 3 is for a change in polling place location to serve the voters in Ward 2, Precinct 9. This change in location requires formal action by the City Council, and that action must be completed no later than May 11th this year to become effective in time for this year's primary and general election. Here to make the staff presentation is Tim Schwartz from our Elections and Voter Services Division.
The chatting will be Casey Carl from the
sorry.
City Clerk's office, and I'm just going to say there's nothing more to add to the briefing materials we've already provided.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any questions or comments from the committee about this polling location change? All right, with that, I'll defer to Councilmember Gordon for a motion to adopt a resolution formalizing the move in the location of a polling place to serve the voters in Ward 2, Precinct 9. That is a motion to move the polling place from Augsburg College to Matthew Park's multipurpose room.
Well put. I'm happy to move approval. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and that motion is adopted, and the resolution will be forwarded with our positive recommendation to the full City Council for its action at the regular meeting this Friday. All right, skipping back to item number 2. This is a staff report on the 2017 municipal election, a copy of which was distributed to our offices yesterday and which is also posted to the website for public access. With that, I'll ask the staff to make the formal presentation. Mr. Carl.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. As noted, my name is Casey Carr. I have the privilege of serving as clerk of the city of Minneapolis, and in that capacity, also serve as its chief elections official. And as indicated, my team and I are here to present a report on the 2017 municipal election, outlining lessons learned and recommendations for the future. Before diving into that presentation, I'd like to take a quick opportunity to introduce the members of our city's elections and voter services team who are here with us. First, our team of professional administrators includes Tim Schwartz, Jeff Narrowbrook, if you'd stand. Jeff Narrowbrook and Eric Jeffries Burns. These three are supported by our core seasonal team of supervisors, Kate Redden, Abby Sullivan, Mary Davis, Karen Scheel, Greg Munson, and John Martin. And the elections division is also supported by our department's technology team, Grant Johnson, Shar Peterson, and Aaron Grossman. And then this year, we were fortunate to include Assistant Clerk Christian Rommelhoff in our operations. He served as our lead ranked choice voting tabulator and process coordinator. I thought I saw him over on the side. And then our work was also publicized and made more accessible and certainly much more engaging by our communications coordinator, Mitch Camp, who's standing there taking a picture, as well as the input and help of our colleagues from the IT or Information Technology Department, JP Heisel and Rick Paulson. See, JP is here and Rick Paulson on the side. They were the ones who visualized the data results across the tabulations and posted that to our website, and was also helping post that to our social media platforms. So to the entire team, that was a great thanks. And then also all of these team members and the more than 1,600 individuals who served as judges, seasonal staff, and temporary workers in 2017 under the guidance and direction of our elections director, Grace Wackler-Rhodes. So the whole team, most of them here in one place, and wanted to recognize them as we get started with this presentation. What I get to present today is the results of their work. So this first slide provides a snapshot of the 2017 municipal election with an estimated population of more than 421,000 people. Minneapolis is the largest municipal jurisdiction in Minnesota. From an elections perspective, based on our numbers alone, the city of Minneapolis operates like a county within a county because it operates within the confines of Hennepin County. Our population and our registered voting base make Minneapolis larger than all but 4 counties in the state of Minnesota. And the fact that we administer our municipal election in the off year and that we use ranked choice voting further distinguishes our work from other election jurisdictions in the state. Furthermore, our municipal ballot features a total of 22 seats because all of our municipal offices are up for election at the same time, and that includes a mix of single seat and multi-seat races. So again, a factor that makes Minneapolis different from any other jurisdiction in the state of Minnesota. The 46-day early voting period for last year's election began on September 22. It ran through November 6th. In total, just shy of 12,000 voters cast their ballots before Election Day, achieving an 11% turnout, whether as a result of vote by mail or in-person voting at the city's early vote center. Still, despite this strong early voting turnout, the vast majority of our voters chose to cast their ballots on Election Day at their assigned polling place. Election Day voters totaled more than 93,000, as shown on this slide. Combined, the early vote and Election Day totals represented a total turnout of approximately 42% of about 105,000 voters who did participate in the 2017 municipal election. This slide shows turnout for municipal elections over a 24-year period from 1993 to 2017. Last year, Minneapolis returned to voter turnout levels seen earlier during this 2-decade time frame, which is also on par with years prior to 1993. There has been concern about turnout in off-year municipal-only elections, but I wanted to highlight what I truly believe is, for Minneapolis in many ways, a victim of its own success. And that's because our municipal elections follow in the off year immediately after the regular presidential election. For a city that routinely achieves some of the highest levels of voter participation, in a state routinely ranking highest among all states in the nation for voter participation, the drop-off between the high mark of a presidential year election compared to the turnout we have in a municipal year can feel like there's a much more significant drop and a potential lack of participation in local city elections. So when we're able to achieve almost 80% of a turnout in the 2016 presidential election, but we only hit 42% in the next year's municipal election, that 38-point drop-off feels pretty severe to us. But when you compare 42% turnout for our local-only odd-year election to the turnout that we achieved in 2014's midterm election, which is about 58%, there's only a 16-point difference in that turnout. So it puts our local city elections in an odd year on par with what we might expect in a midterm election. And in that context, I'd suggest that Minneapolis is doing quite well with its local elections. As you can see here, the average turnout for municipal elections across the United States is approximately 15%, which is significantly lower than what we have achieved in Minneapolis. That's almost a 27-point difference just for last year's election alone. So again, when compared to national averages, Minneapolis is doing very good in terms of voter participation in our municipal elections. Nevertheless, Minneapolis has never been a city that lets good stand in the way of great, and in that regard, the Charter Commission is considering a proposal to amend our city charter, which would, if approved, transition municipal elections into the regular cycle during even-numbered years. Recent research in other states where odd-year municipal elections have been moved into the even-numbered cycles has shown strong potential to boost turnout and participation, with an average increase anywhere between 8 to 15 points in turnout, depending on if that transition puts the municipal election in a gubernatorial or a presidential election year. The Charter Commission hopes to complete its research in the coming year to frame a decision that could be then submitted to voters during the 2020 presidential election.
Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Ellison and Mr. Carl. Would that proposal result in any financial savings if we were to move from an off year to a broader, regularly scheduled election cycle?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vice President has asked a question that the Charter Commission is actually exploring now. They have a research assistant who is presenting a report at their next meeting, a graduate student from the University of Minnesota who happens, I believe, to still be in the audience, is working with us this year on elections. And that report will analyze, among other things, the issues that should be considered before a decision is made about moving municipal elections. There are a lot of complicated factors about when municipal elections are scheduled. Municipal elections were moved into odd years deliberately deliberately back during the progressive era of the 1920s, specifically so that people could focus on turnout in local elections. So there wasn't a competition, as it was seen, between local elections and federal and state elections. But more recently, times have changed, and places in California that have had their elections in the odd years and were only achieving about a 9% to a 14% turnout did move their elections into even-numbered years and saw that turnout boost by 8 to 15%. So the question would be, could we anticipate achieving similar turnout, knowing that we already have an above-average turnout in our odd-year elections? Would it offer savings to the city to do so? And then, of course, with technology, could we retain ranked choice voting, which is much different than first-past-the-post traditional voting in terms of ballot layout, design, and programming? So all of those issues are on the table and being considered by the Charter Commission in its research. And some of those issues I do intend to touch on towards the end of this presentation when I bring ranked choice voting into the national context.
We have a question from Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How can a person in Minneapolis learn more about what the Charter Commission is considering and get involved?
We do have a website, Madam President, through the chair. There's a website about the Charter Commission where its meetings, its agendas, information reports are posted. That's accessible through the council's legislative information management system. They also have their own site. So from the city's main website, there's a link that says government, and under there is a link to the charter. And so there's a link to the Charter Commission's separate page, a list of members. There are 15 members. They are appointed by the chief judge of the district court. It's always interesting to remind people the city's Charter Commission is not a city agency. They're a state agency that functions, as we say, the charter is our constitution. They are the standing constitutional convention of the city then that has primary oversight of our charter.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had one more question. I was curious if you know if they're considering in their research the impact of switching the cycle on spending in campaigns. And then I would just add that we might consider, if that sort of significant change was made, our role in funding local campaigns. It might be a good time to look at what we're doing now, what other cities have done to consider municipal funding of campaigns. We saw an unprecedented amount of outside spending, I think, in this local election cycle last time. And, I would just be concerned that we consider that along with the other questions that would be asked. Obviously, I think it's exciting to imagine what such increased turnout could do, but there seem to be other questions to ask along with it.
Mr. Chair, I can't speak to all those points. I would simply say that we do have in the audience, and I failed to recognize her, Jean Massey, the Executive Director of Fair Vote, who has been a strong partner throughout this process during my tenure and prior, but also through her access to national research on such issues. Also, the Charter Commission would be, I think, well informed of this body's concerns on issues to be included as the scope of any question of moving what is the city's elections into a new year. If there's nothing else, Mr. Chair, I'll continue. So then in 2006, of course, as you know, Minneapolis voters adopted ranked choice voting on a 2-to-1 margin. As shown on this slide, last year marked the third experience that Minneapolis had with this alternative voting methodology, and as the saying goes, the third time's the charm. You can see that there were increases in all of the metrics that were universally reviewed for elections, from general population to the number of registered voters to absentee participation to total turnout. So, for example, between 2009 and when RCV debuted to last year's elections, there was a total increase in the city's population of more than 9%, with an estimated total population exceeding 420,000 in 2017. Here you can see that there was a significant increase in early voting over the 3 municipal cycles. In fact, in-person early voting set new records twice last year, showing that the convenience of early voting with the city's dedicated early vote center has had a positive impact on our voters. This is particularly true for voters from communities historically disengaged or having lower rates of engagement. Here you can see we had an increase of almost 10% in terms of total election day turnout between 2009 and 2017. Just beneath that, I'd like to highlight the significant increase in election day registrations. That's an increase of about 231%. Minnesota is one of only 11 states in the nation, as well as the District of Columbia, to offer its voters the benefit of election day registration. And this is important because it's another way to eliminate the #1 barrier to higher rates of participation: registration. Led by the state of Oregon, where it was first implemented, 12 states plus the District of Columbia have now approved what's called automatic voter registration. And 20 states have introduced proposals to allow automatic registration just this year in 2018. Sadly, the state of Minnesota is not among them. But back to our local RCV analysis, this slide indicates that increasing voter option and convenience has supported increased levels of turnout and participation, and this is reflected in the final metric, which is total turnout. Here you see that total turnout increased more than 130% from 2009 to 2017. That total turnout achieved last year was on par, as I mentioned, with what would be more typical of a midterm election at the lower end. In the midterm year, Minneapolis usually would expect to have between 40 and 60% turnout. So this is, in my opinion, an admirable accomplishment for a municipal election that is in an off year. Over the past 3 municipal election cycles, we have made significant strides in refining the ranked choice voting policy provisions as well as improvements in how we administer election procedures. These are captured on this slide showing improvements made in each of those cycles. As you can see, we learned from the first experience in 2009 that we needed to expedite tabulation processes. The first RCV election had the lowest turnout, but it required a full 15 days to complete hand counting every ballot before announcing unofficial winners. And of course, it was our first time using ranked choice voting, so we were really inventing a new kind of wheel that year, and delays were to be expected. As a result of those experiences, however, we amended the RCV ordinance to allow for unofficial winners to be declared on election night based on ranked first choices against a maximum possible threshold. We eliminated the requirement to tabulate undeclared write-in candidates, which is consistent with how reporting results are done for county, state, and federal elections. And we improved policy guidelines to normalize voter errors that give every ballot the fullest possibility of being counted. After the 2013 municipal election, we amended the ordinance to allow for batch elimination of multiple candidates where it was mathematically impossible to carry forward based on the full set of ballot data and all rankings in every race on the ballot. We also clarified some administrative provisions related to tabulation, including the process to address the potential for ties in rounds of tabulation. With these policy and process improvements in place and working well, the most significant need at this point is a fully automated system capable of tabulating ranked choice voting ballots and producing results as part of a certified system that complies with federal and state standards. In 2009, when ranked choice voting was first implemented in Minneapolis, there were no systems capable of tabulating ranked choice voting ballots. As a consequence, the city's elections team developed the Minneapolis method, which provided a step-by-step process for hand counting and tabulating RCV ballots. That original method still underpins our procedures today and was the basis for how we conducted last year's election in 2017. The policy and procedural improvements we made were further enhanced by new systems purchased in 2013 by Hennepin County. These new systems produce a cast vote record, which is an exportable data file, which helps to streamline our tabulation processes, even if the system is not yet fully automated. This slide depicts those improvements with the original manual process shown on the left of the screen in blue and the hybrid system shown on the right in orange, which was used in 2013-2017. As you can see, the hybrid system eliminates the most time-consuming and the most costly aspects of the original manual procedure. So as a result, Minneapolis went from a 15-day tabulation process to produce winners in 2009 to announcing all unofficial winners in all races in less than 24 hours after the polls closed in 2017. That represented a substantial savings, not only in terms of production timeline, but cost as well. In 2013, Elections and Voter Services launched its first voter outreach and education effort aimed at ensuring all voters were familiar with ranked choice voting and the correct way that ranked choices could be marked on a ballot. Voter education had been outsourced prior to that in 2009, but since 2013, the city has taken the lead for its own outreach and education plans, and we've continued to build on the success of that initial program each year. Today, voter outreach and education is a core function of our team. In fact, it's reflected in our division's name, Elections and Voter Services. In this regard, we stand in debt to Anissa Hollingshed, who led the voter outreach and education program from 2013 to 2016 before leaving Minneapolis to become the city clerk and director of communications for the city of Rochester. Last year, in her absence, Mitch Camp took the lead on voter engagement, and his work, particularly in terms of our social media accounts, has been recognized across the nation by other election jurisdictions. In fact, he's been invited to teach a class on voter outreach at the Election Centers Academy later this year. And our local media even recognized his efforts. He was interviewed on Minnesota Public Radio about his efforts to publicize last year's municipal election. I've highlighted one response to his work from Adam Ambrogi, shown on this slide. Mr. Ambrogi is the program director for the Democracy Fund's Responsive Politics, and it says that in response to a video produced by Mr. Camp, this is what it looks like when local government takes an active role of promoting civic participation through voting. As I've reported in the past, I'm incredibly proud of our division's leadership across the nation in terms of our outreach, education, and engagement with voters, and I do believe that it contributes to our sustained high levels of participation that help define Minneapolis as a civic-minded community. Of course, I skipped too fast. The centerpiece of our education and engagement efforts is the Voter Information Guide, which is also pictured on this slide. This guide is mailed to all households in the city the week before Election Day. Every guide includes details about the 3 methods of voting: vote by mail, early in person, or at the polls on Election Day. Instructions on how to register in advance or at the polls to take advantage of Election Day registration, as well as how to access your sample ballot and use it to practice in advance. Key election dates, as well as pre-registration periods, dates for absentee balloting, and information about election days, such as basic voting instructions and our own contact information. Descriptions about all offices that appear on the ballot, instructions on how ranked choice voting works and how to properly mark an RCV ballot, the location of all 132 precincts, the site of each precinct's assigned polling place and its operating hours, and finally a copy of Minnesota's Voter Bill of Rights as codified in statute. 85% of our post-election survey participants, including both voters and non-voters, identified this information guide as being helpful, and 79% indicated that this city voter information guide was the primary source of information they had for learning about the 2017 municipal election, about ranked choice voting, and the details about how to participate effectively. That strong score was an increase of 14% compared to similar responses from 2013. So as I've informed this committee in prior years, the voter information guide is the single best effort we make to educate and engage voters. The post-election survey data proves that, and at 44 cents per piece, I think it's the most cost-effective means of achieving those impressive results. In 2017, absentee balloting accounted for just over 11% of total voter participation, as I said at the beginning. As seen on this slide, the bulk of early voters opted to cast their ballots in person at our early vote center, located about 1 block north of City Hall. In total, more than 9,000 voters used this method to participate in last year's election, which was approximately 3 of every 4 voters casting early ballots. The Early Vote Center offers all voters easy access and the added security of a single facility that ensures access to the ballot box free of undue influence, intimidation, or distraction. The site of the Early Vote Center is along major corridor routes. It includes a small area for voter-only parking and sufficient space to handle a high-volume turnout with all of our absentee functions, both in person, by mail, and ballot board, in a single facility. The 46-day absentee period also maximizes convenience for our voters, who can then plan when they wish to participate, rather than waiting for Election Day. The Early Vote Center is open during regular business hours, Monday through Friday, from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., and offers extended hours in the final 2-week period leading to Election Day, where we actually extend our weekday hours and include weekend hours on both Saturdays and Sundays before Election Day. With the council's strong leadership, Minneapolis now provides, as part of its regular voter service programming every year, more hours during that 46-day absentee period than any other jurisdiction in the state of Minnesota. And finally, the Early Vote Center affords all voters equal access to greater resources, where there are qualified election judges, interpreters, and personnel to support curbside voting and other kinds of assistance for voters who need or want additional time and support to participate with independence and dignity. Because of these added conveniences, I think that turnout through early in-person voting will continue to increase in future years, as evidenced in other jurisdictions across the nation. Of course, voter service and convenience can and does contribute to higher turnout, but it's also important to remember that absentee balloting is a 46-day period that leads to Election Day. The reality of that fact and the practical impact on the city in terms of its staffing, resourcing, and financing is that Elections and Voter Services is actually conducting Election Day activities for 46 days before Election Day. And for every voter who chooses to cast a ballot early, we're obligated to provide the same level of service, to the same exacting levels of detail, to the same level of security, subject to the same levels of intense scrutiny that happen on Election Day. It's the single most expensive aspect of our elections, and the resources to support it are likely to increase as more and more voters take advantage of the convenience that's offered by early voting. This slide illustrates the impact of absentee balloting in all years between 2008 and 2017, including presidential, midterm, and municipals. As you can see, The impact continues to increase. The 2016 presidential election shown here in red is an anomaly. It's an outstanding factor. And I think what it really reflects is the impact of some state policy changes. In 2014, the state enacted no excuse absentee balloting, meaning that voters no longer had to choose from 5 excuses written into the state law why they wanted to vote before Election Day. So starting in 2014, if you wanted to vote early, you could. You didn't have to have an excuse. In 2016, we had the permission to implement direct balloting, which the rest of the nation knows as early voting, true early voting, where you get your ballot at the early vote center, you fill it out, and you put it into the tabulator, and it's counted right then and there. So I think those combinations of no excuse, absentee balloting, direct balloting, and the fact that in the 2016 presidential, we operated 4 multiple early vote centers to provide maximum convenience shows why we hit 27.5% turnout through absentees, definitely hitting a new high mark there. It did carry over in lesser degrees into the 2017 election, principally because of the convenience and people were more aware of no excuse absentee balloting and direct balloting. This slide here then gives more detail over the last 5 elections. As you can see, again, the overall trends. The green line shown here is absentee balloting by mail, which has been the traditional way people participate absentee. Absentee balloting by mail is traditionally the high point. The orange line shows absentee balloting in person, which tends to be a little bit lower, especially in even-numbered years, than by mail. But you can see, again, that combination that happened in 2016 shows this major increase in in-person turnout. Again, at 2016, those inverted, and I believe that we will continue to see the orange line go up in future years as the convenience offered by in-person absentee balloting, especially if we do go back to offering multiple locations, engages and provides more opportunity for voters to access the ballot. The mayor and council have identified growing the population as a long-term strategic goal of the city. This slide shows the steady population increases over the last 26 years, starting in 1991. The population is shown on the green line on this chart. Just since the 2000 census, Minneapolis has gained about 14% in population to an estimated 421,000 residents in 2017. At the same time, the red colored line tracks the number of precincts we have that serve our voters. So you can see that in 2000, we reached a tipping point, at which point the population starts to exceed the number of precincts we have to serve it. And that resulted in long lines and wait times in our 2012 presidential election. For those of you who remember that experience, we had some precincts where there were long wait times in excess of 6 hours during the 2012 presidential election. Since then, the city has added some additional precincts, but that level has been insufficient to serve the population and as it continues to grow. The desire for population growth, which is already happening, will increase the pressure on the existing number of precincts we have, particularly in high turnout elections like the upcoming 2020 presidential, let alone in what we anticipate will be a high turnout elections this year in the 2018 midterm. If left unchecked, policymakers should expect the net effect would probably be long lines and wait times again on election day. Here you can see a comparison of our population and precincts from 1990 to 2017. In 1990, when the population was approximately 368,000, Minneapolis supported a total of 172 precincts. But last year, despite the growth to more than 421,000, we had fewer precincts, 132. So as it shows here, we've added about more than 50,000 residents, or about a 14% gain. We've still short 40 precincts from what we had in 1990, or a 23% loss. So we will need to be considering with council available options to better address the allocation of this growing population amongst our precincts next year, which will be a time for us to review and prepare prior to the 2020 presidential election. Although the core function of ensuring access to the ballot box remains unchanged from year to year, the way that we do that and how we provide access seems to change every year. And in 2017, through a partnership with our colleagues at Hennepin County, Elections and Voter Services deployed electronic poll books to streamline Election Day check-in and registration functions at the polls. Shown here, these small devices, which are actually iPads, eliminate the time-consuming and extremely costly requirement to produce printed, paper-based roster books. Leveraging technology, we're now able to check in a voter and expedite the service to the voter in the polls, which helps reduce the lines and wait times I just mentioned. It saves money, and it improves our overall operations, both on the front end as well as on the back end of the election. I can share with you that our election judges loved this technology. I was a little leery about introducing the new technology. In fact, some cases our judges have already told us they're not coming back if we go back to paper-based roster books. They're very cumbersome, costly, and difficult to use. So to improve on that new technology, we created a new judge position called the registration specialist. These judges were given extra training on the use of the new technology so that they were fully conversant and confident in their ability to perform at the polls on election day. In the past, we've had difficulty recruiting election judges to work the registration post. It's the hardest one in the poll on election day. With the poll books, or EPBs as we call them, we now have judges who look forward to doing that role and are excited to participate. With feedback from our judges and our core staff, we are discussing potential system improvements with Hennepin County and with our vendor, No Inc. For this year and future election years as well, it's important to credit Hennepin County and its director, Jenny Gelms, for leading on this initiative. Hennepin County covered the costs for purchasing these new systems, including the hardware, software, and negotiated terms to cover implementation for us, as well as deployment and extensive testing throughout the city on 2 different occasions prior to Election Day. We would not have had the success with EPB rollout last year without our partnership with the county. This slide shows a heat-colored map that reflects turnout across the entire city, coded by individual precincts. The lighter colors here indicate less turnout. The darker colors reflect precincts with higher turnout. So as you can see, the highest voter turnout was achieved in these precincts, serving the Bryn Mawr, Cedar Riverside, Seward, Kenwood, and Lyndhurst neighborhoods found in the 2nd, 6th, 7th, and 13th wards. Those areas shown the lower turnout are the University neighborhood, both in the 2nd and 3rd wards, as well as Marcy Holmes, Near North, McKinley, and Hawthorne neighborhoods found in the 2nd, 4th, and 5th wards. This is consistent with prior years. It shows that our turnout tends to reflect a divide between higher turnout in the west and southwest areas and lower turnout primarily centered in the north. For me, this indicates where the city needs to focus our outreach and engagement efforts and where we could potentially pay less attention in terms of early engagement. In short, consistent with themes you've heard from other departments across multiple areas of municipal service delivery and policy considerations I know you are already engaging in, more investment, attention, and resources are needed from elections and voter services in North Minneapolis. In any election, there's a potential for voters to mismark their ballots in a way that prevents or does not allow them to be fully tabulated. With ranked choice voting, there are some unique types of ballot errors that need to be addressed. These include overvoting, which is where a voter chooses more than one candidate at a single ranking in the same race. Skipped ranking, which is ranking a candidate at a lower ranking, skipping a higher ranking level. And repeat ranking, sometimes called bullet voting, which is where a voter picks the same candidate in all available rankings in a single race. Recognizing the potential for human error, Minnesota election law requires that administrators make every effort to count every ballot and prevent ballots from being rejected purely for technical reasons. So we had to provide within the ordinance a process for how to normalize and interpret voter intent. We've done that, and this slide shows for overvoting there was a higher occurrence in our multiple seat races. Otherwise, the ratios of overvoting errors were similar between 2013 and 17, less than 1% of all the ballots cast. It's possible that future improvements in ballot design could further improve our ability to reduce the error rate for overvotes. The rate of skipped rankings dropped slightly in 2017 compared to 2013. Nearly half of all instances involved a skipped ranking. The voter skipped the first choice but went on to rank a second and in some cases a third choice. I think that skipped ranking the data don't prove this, but I think it may reflect voters who are attempting to strategically vote on the ballot, thinking mistakenly that if I skip my first choice and rank my top candidate in my second choice, that gives them an advantage. This is not true. We cover that through our voter education, but I think this reflects voters who still believe there's some advantage to doing so. Instructions on how to correctly mark a ranked choice voting ballot are printed on the top of every ballot, and our judges do provide summary instructions to voters before giving them their official ballots. Nevertheless, we still have these errors. The highest source of ballot errors results from repeat rankings, again, bullet voting. This was true in 2013 and again in 2017. This type of error was found in more than 3% of all the races voted. It occurred at least 10 times more than overvoting or skipped ranking. And again, I think one explanation for this is a misunderstanding of the ballot. It's a person who thinks if I mark one candidate, my first, second, and third choice, that really will make sure that they have an advantage. And again, this is not true. Another concern is the potential for drop-off in rankings compared to the total number of ranking choices that are allowed on the ballot. In all three RCV elections, 2009, 2013, and 2017, Minneapolis provided a total of 3 rankings per race, including, of course, the option for a write-in candidate. Of the 22 races on the ballot in 2017, 5 had 2 or fewer declared candidates. In contrast, the mayoral race had a total of 16 declared candidates. The park board at large race had 9 declared candidates. The other 15 races had at least 3, and in some cases 4 candidates on the ballot. Generally, the frequency for voters who ranked more than one choice in 2017 mirrored the same thing from 2013. The races that had 3 rankings used by a majority of voters last year included the mayor's race, council wards 3, 5, 10, and 11, and the park board at large race. The low overall rate of ballot errors combined with our post-election data shows that most voters, in fact, the significant majority, understood how to rank their preferences and were more likely to do so in those races with a higher number of candidates on the ballot. So from this, it would appear to us that candidate quantity may be a primary factor in motivating voters to use more options on their ballot. The data also do suggest that providing 3 rankings may be sufficient for the majority of voters. In most cases on the ballot, as I indicated, people did not rank more than 1. In those where there were high competition and multiple numbers of candidates, they took advantage of that. This slide provides a breakdown of the total staffing for the 2017 election. You can see the largest part of that is tied to Election Day, when we deployed 1,537 election judges to serve our 132 precincts. It represents 95% of the total staffing. As I mentioned earlier, absentee balloting, shown here in purple, accounts for the next highest amount because of running Election Day for 46 days prior to elections. This slide breaks down race and ethnicity of our election judge corps, and I know that time is short, but I wanted to highlight here that we have made efforts and have been successful in diversifying the core of our election judges. It ties to our goal of making sure that the people who staff our precincts look like the communities they're serving. In 2017, our demographic makeup of election judges is still slightly under the breakdown of communities across the city. And as in prior years, then, we continue to have a higher percentage of judges who self-identify as being white. However, we have made gains in the other demographic groupings. You can also see on this slide, too, there's a significant volume of judges who chose not to self-report at 30%, 480 some. So there is a large group of people who have not self-reported for whatever means. So it's possible our numbers are better than what this slide seems to indicate. On a positive trend, I would like to note here, as it concerns our student election judge program, beyond the service that these students give to the community, is that it helps us plant seeds for the future. Many of our student judges return year after year, often helping us to recruit friends from school. And research has shown that voting is behavioral. That is, those who engage early and frequently are more likely to develop a lifelong habit of participating in the ballot. So by connecting with these students now at their earliest opportunity, we're helping to plant those seeds for future generations of voters. The majority of our student judge program participants come from communities historically underrepresented, disengaged, not involved. So this is, I think, one of our finest accomplishments, is seeding in these new emerging voters the opportunity to be engaged and a lifelong habit of the importance of voting. As noted, we do have room for improvement in diversifying the core of our election judges, and we will continue to collaborate with our community-based partners over the long term as we look to make our precincts reflect the communities they serve. The next few slides focus just on municipal turnout. This shows a 24-year period between 1993 and 2017. In this slide, the red line indicates actual voter turnout. The green line is the total eligible number of registered voters. So in other words, as I've put on that slide, there is a voter gap between those who did participate and those who could have. It shows that we do have a growing number of people that could vote, but for whatever reason have not. This slide shows the same 24-year timeline for those elections between 93 and 2017. Again, the red line here is actual voter turnout, people who cast the ballot, and the green line still represents the number of registered voters, those who were qualified and could have, but did not. But this slide also includes the blue line that shows our total population, and a new line, that orange line, the second from the top. The orange line represents a new set of data that's pulled from several national data sets, including the U.S. Census Bureau. It's what's referred to as the Citizen Voting Age Population, or CVAP. The CVAP estimates the total population in the city that, based on those national data sets, they believe are eligible to vote based on citizenship status, age, and other factors. So when you consider that orange line, our potential voter gap increases. That has a net effect of suppressing or depressing our actual turnout. So while I'm pretty proud, very proud, that we achieved a 42% turnout when you just look between the red and green, if you factor up to the orange, we only achieved about a 31. That's still significantly higher than the national average of 15. But when we consider that that gap is available and we need to go after those people, it gives us more incentive to work to close those gaps into the future. This slide reflects feedback from our post-election survey, following on what I just said about gaps. The survey includes voters and non-voters in 2009, 2013, and 17. It focuses on reasons given why I didn't vote, why I did not choose to participate in the municipal election. And this chart shows that the percentage of non-voters who said they didn't participate was because they don't care to vote in city elections. They don't vote for the city. Worse yet, the percentage of non-voters claiming this as a reason that they are not engaging has increased over each of those 3 election cycles. So in 2017, the number of 33% of self-identified non-voters who participated said they didn't vote because they don't care to vote in city elections is mostly true of young, millennial-aged voters between the ages of 18 and 34, those with lower levels of educational attainment, and it's much more likely to be true of men than women. I'm going to stand on a soapbox for a minute with your indulgence. These young voters are part of what political and social scientists have termed the rising American electorate, or RAE, R-A-E for short. This potential voting bloc includes people of color, unmarried women, and millennials. Collectively, they represent more than half of the entire voting eligible population in the United States, accounting for about 59% of all potential voters in the United States. This voting bloc, just by numbers alone, could be expected to determine the outcome of every election if its members coalesced around a candidate, issue, party, or platform. Yet these groups are also the most volatile and sporadic in terms of participation. For example, of the approximate 40 million Americans that researchers predict will drop off for this year's midterm, nearly 2/3 come from eligible groups who won't participate, and this includes the young millennial-aged voters and unmarried women, matching trends that were seen in 2008 and 2014. The emergence of the millennial generation has the potential to most significantly impact the future of our elections. First, this demographic group is the largest just in terms of size since the baby boomers, and they're projected to surpass the baby boomer generation. In fact, by 2020's presidential election, just 2 years from now, an estimated 90 million millennials will be eligible to vote, which could account for up to 40% of the entire voter base, if they turn out. Second, millennials are the most diverse American generation to date, with fully 40% of them identifying as non-white. The emerging generation has a nuanced, fluid understanding of identity, which does not fit neatly into a small handful of pre-selected boxes on a census questionnaire. And how they engage has yet to be fully understood, but it is clear that the emerging electorate refuses to be easily labeled, and this will undoubtedly require more nimble and responsive political strategies by candidates and parties to gain their favor. Third, a significant majority of millennials support progressive views on benchmark issues at much higher rates than the rest of the population. Millennials on the whole are very community conscious, support progressive and philanthropic policies and causes, but at the same time exhibit distrust and even disregard for established government and political institutions. Of course, demography does not automatically equal destiny, but voters are definitely not static. Demographics of the emerging majority give a clear insight into the potential future of elections based only on these numbers. And they give us a good idea of how we need to shape our outreach and engagement efforts in the future to ensure that this growing collection of historically underrepresented and disengaged groups are given a clear path to the ballot box. Every year since implementing ranked choice voting, the city's conducted a post-election survey of voters, non-voters, candidates, and election judges. The Morris Leatherman Company, a local full-service market research firm, has conducted these surveys in 2013 and 17. The entire survey report and its results was appended to your report for your review. This first slide shows voter perceptions of ranked choice voting. So as you can see, the vast majority of the survey participants indicated ranked choice voting was simple to understand and use. The number of participants indicating that ranked choice voting was difficult decreased from 2013 to 2017. As indicated in my earlier comments about ballot error, the post-election survey data show that voters understood how to mark their ballots correctly, and many did so, at least in some races, make more than one choice on the ballot in 2017. But the number of participants indicating that they ranked only one preferred candidate on the ballot did increase slightly. Overall, the majority of voters know what RCV is. They know how to mark their ballots correctly to rank their preferences if they have them. This last slide shows that most survey participants agreed ranked choice voting should continue to be used for future municipal elections. In fact, there was a 13-point increase in the number of participants who positively agreed RCV should be used in the future. Likewise, there was a 21-point decrease in the number of participants who said ranked choice voting should not be used. But it would appear, based on the increase in the don't know category, that it's likely most voters have come to accept ranked choice voting is the method that Minneapolis uses. They know how to do it, and they know how to rank their ballot in order to cast it. I mentioned ranked choice voting in the national context. It has gained a lot of recognition in the last 4 years. In fact, a significant number of bills have been introduced in states since 2016 to authorize the use of ranked choice voting in elections for local jurisdictions and even in some cases entire states. This slide shows the status of some of those proposals by state with this disclaimer. This map shows from 2016, more bills have been introduced in 2017. Some bills have died. Some bills have been reintroduced. They're in committee. So this is a very dynamic, quickly changing environment we find ourselves in. Probably the most prominent focus right now in the nation, of course, is the state of Maine, where ranked choice voting will be implemented on a statewide basis for its upcoming gubernatorial primary on June 12th. The other focus, ironically, is the state of Minnesota, which was one of the early adopters of ranked choice voting for local jurisdictions. The two largest cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, already have ranked choice voting in place, and the governing body in St. Louis Park recently voted to enable ranked choice voting for its municipal elections as well. But at the same time, as you know, a proposal passed the state Senate that would, if adopted, eliminate even the possibility of existing opt-in authorities for local jurisdictions to choose ranked choice voting, eliminating any choice for those communities' voters to choose ranked choice voting if it's right for them. This restriction would also apply to jurisdictions where ranked choice voting was approved by a vote of the people, as in home rule charter cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul. The excellent news to share on this front is that all of this activity and interest has finally moved the vendor community. With entire states now proposing to transition, there's sufficient interest to pursue development of a fully automated system capable of tabulating ranked choice voting ballots. Just a few weeks ago, Ms. Walker-Rowitz and I had the honor of participating in a web forum hosted by the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center on the state of ranked choice voting today. As part of that forum, several leading vendors of election systems demonstrated their newest models, and this slide summarizes the state of the vendor community. As you can see, two of the vendors have systems that demonstrated the ability to automate the tabulation of ranked choice voting ballots. Those are Dominion and ES&S, shaded here in gray. ES&S is the vendor used in Hennepin County and thus by the city of Minneapolis. It's my understanding ES&S is also the vendor that will be used in Maine for its implementation on June 12th. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center at the bottom of this slide also has created a universal system that is simply software. It doesn't come with hardware, called Bright Spots. It's an open source system. It is able to fully automate RCV tabulation. It's configurable and compatible with other systems. Because it's software only, the costs obviously are potentially much less in terms of using it, potentially in compatibility with our existing ES&S software. There was some interesting demonstrations where they took our 2013 ballot, which had, as you know, quite a long list of candidates in the office for mayor, and they were able to reproduce that ballot in minutes, not days, and provide the same results that we achieved over a 24-hour period. So a lot of good news on the vendor community coming down the pike as we move towards potentially many more jurisdictions and even states choosing ranked choice voting for its voters. This slide summarizes some of the recommendations from the report, talks about continuing our voter outreach and education efforts, focusing those on underrepresented communities. The two that I wanted to highlight, we've talked a little bit about the last two bullets, working with the Charter Commission again on its exploration of a potential charter amendment regarding the timing of municipal elections and possibly changing those so that they would coincide with either presidential or gubernatorial elections in the regular cycle. And then, of course, beginning our preparations for the 2020 presidential election and the 2020 census and the 2021-2022 redistricting. So this year's election sets off what I'd like to at least plant the seed with this group, the policy body for the city, is a 5-year window of great importance. This year, residents, voters will choose the people who hold the seats in DC and in our state legislature who ultimately decide where lines are drawn based on the 2020 census. So this year we have the midterm election that is going to put in office people who will be in charge of census. In 2020, we'll have a presidential election, which in and of itself will probably be a high mark for us, we would expect. We will also do the census. Following the census in 2021 and 22, we will do the redistricting and the redrawing of all of those federal, state, and local lines, which create representation opportunities. That's how we get represented, and through representation, we derive federal and state funding. And then, of course, in 2021, we have the next election for this body using ranked choice voting. So a very active 5-year window for elections and voter services. And then finally, Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, I'm showing on this slide a picture of Mary Davis as she received an honorary proclamation from Mayor Frey earlier this year. After last year's elections, Mary Davis retired from our group of seasonal staffers. She served for 14 years directly managing our student election judge program. January 25th was declared by Mayor Fry to be Mary Davis Day in recognition of her leadership of the student election judge program and its efforts to educate the next generation about the importance of voting and civic engagement. She's here with us today, and with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, I'd like to invite her to join me at the podium. As you are aware, we do have a certificate for Ms. Davis from the mayor and city council that I have here. Again, in honor of your own time, I won't pause our ceremony to present this formally with members. I'm hoping we can grab a photo afterwards with the members of the council, obviously to respect her work. But Mary, this certificate from the council simply says, "This certificate of commendation is presented hereby to Mary Davis with gratitude, appreciation, and sincere thanks for her leadership of the Minneapolis Student Election Judge Program over the course of 14 years. Because of her commitment, the city's Student Election Judge Program has grown year after year, increasing the number of active and returning students whose awareness of and appreciation for free, impartial, and equitable access to the ballot box and the importance of representative forms of democracy have been influenced by her work. It is said the legacy of heroes is the inheritance of a great example, and in her many contributions to and leadership of the Minneapolis Student Election Judge Program, Mary Davis has been and will always be an Election Day hero," presented by the City Council. Again, I will invite all of you to join us for a photo with Ms. Davis afterwards. With that, Mr. Chair, I have concluded my comments. I'm happy to respond to any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Carl, and thank you, Mary, for your service. Are there any questions from the committee? Councilmember Cunningham?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I just wanted to take the time to say thank you and thank you to the whole team. I know that this was a huge undertaking. My results were announced the next day, and I wasn't sure how long it was going to take, and I was like, wait, already? It's already ready? And so I just have to say, I know how much work went into making sure that it was a smooth election. It was funny on social media. I mean, y'all did a really, really great job. I last night, as I was reading through this lovely report, I would say that there was one thing that jumped out that I'm a little bit skeptical about, and it's the election candidates' responses to it. I'm just kind of curious, how many of my colleagues actually sent back to the survey that was sent out? So a few folks did. See, I see the, yeah. Well, because because with such a low rate, I was a little bit like, I feel like folks who maybe lost might be a little bit more motivated to talk negatively about ranked choice voting, and so therefore are more motivated to return the letter. That was the only way that we were engaged, was through a mailed out survey. And I know that it sat on the corner of my desk completed for probably like a month and a half afterwards. And finally I was like, send it in the mail. So I just wanted to name that piece of it, because I have talked to a lot of candidates as well who really enjoyed ranked choice voting, incorporated that into their process. And a lot of us also don't really interact snail mail anymore. So I just wanted to name that little caveat to that piece, because like I said, I feel folks are a little bit more motivated to trash RCV if they were not successful in their last election. So
Thank you. Councilmember Schrader?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also just want to echo the thanks to the department for all the excellent work over the years, and also just wanted to highlight kind of two efforts on the state level. A lot of the things that we do on elections are very much limited by the state, and some of them, first just want to highlight the anything that you can do to push automatic voter registration, and anything we can do as a council to help and highlight that, please let us know. That's something that we're standing in our own way right now. And that we have a policy that works, that other states are leading on, and we need to follow and take notes from them. The second one is also just working on implementing true early voting. Right now, I want to commend the department for the working around the no excuse absentee. So I think as from a user, you don't see that. But this is because we haven't, in my opinion, completed that policy. We're bankrupting other counties around the state at the expense of saying we have one voting that works, and there's better policies and cheaper ways to do it, and anything we can do to help. I just want to throw that out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, I'm not seeing anyone. I just want to echo that thanks to the team for putting these elections together. Elections are a really big part of how we engage folks. It's not the whole of the community's political power, but it's certainly a major part of it. And so I just wanted to thank you for that. I wanted to thank Mr. Carl for the presentation and for your soapbox. I like that soapbox. I may borrow it. So just wanted to say that. With that, I'll note that there are no formal actions required for this report, and so unless there are any objections, I'll direct that this report be received and filed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Awesome. So that should be received and filed.
Thank you.
With that, we've completed all the items on our agenda. Seeing no further business to be presented, we are adjourned.